Bias can masquerade as protocol. On a sun-blistered rural highway, two white deputies pull over a black woman in a silver rental, citing a missing plate. Despite a clear temporary tag in her rear window, she looks like any unremarkable traveler, ripe for intimidation. Deputy Kettering and Wilcox expect obedience. They have no idea she's a U.S. Army lieutenant general, her silence masking decades of clandestine command. When her calm refusal to exit without cause leads to the drawing of a weapon, they unknowingly unleash forces that will upend their world in ways they can't yet imagine. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The narrow road unspooled like an old ribbon laid out across the belly of the countryside, framed on either side by tall grass swaying in the breeze and leaning wooden fences that hadn't been repainted in years. The air was warm, thick with the scent of dust, pine bark, and the sun-baked hush that came only after long stretches of untouched quiet. Lieutenant General Ayanna Trask, dressed in civilian clothes and seated behind the wheel of a silver rental car, watched the landscape with a gaze trained not by curiosity, but by habit, her eyes always moving, always measuring, always 5 seconds ahead of anything that might require a response. She wore no uniform today. No ribbons, no insignia, no visible rank, only a plain charcoal blouse buttoned to the collar, dark slacks neatly pressed, and a black wristwatch that kept to Eastern Standard Time no matter what road she was on. Her posture was upright, but relaxed, her body language composed with the kind of deliberateness that came from decades of silent command. On the seat beside her, resting against a slim leather folder, was a sealed envelope stamped with a federal routing label. The contents weren't dramatic, a post-briefing summary, an internal update, but the weight of that document wasn't in the paper. It was in the room it had come from, a soundless vault of stone and steel where surveillance programs were discussed without names, and foreign ops were debated by people who would never be asked to explain them. She had just left such a place that morning. She'd flown in, driven the route herself without aid or driver, attended the meeting without fanfare, and said only what needed saying. There were other officers, uniformed and upright, who spoke more freely, eager to add to the conversation. Ayanna didn't need to. The moment she leaned forward in her seat and made her point, everyone else stopped talking. Now the sun rode high behind her, casting elongated shadows across the fields as the land stretched outward in both directions, empty and unconcerned. It was beautiful country in its way, wild and unhurried, but to Ayanna it was also the kind of terrain that demanded something quieter than caution, something like readiness. She had moved through combat zones that felt more predictable than places like this, where the wrong glance or the wrong tone could turn into something far heavier than what was written in any law book. It wasn't war she anticipated out here. It was the fragile discomfort of unacknowledged power. Her eyes moved to the mirror at the same moment the flashing lights appeared behind her. Red and blue, reflexively rhythmic. A sheriff's cruiser eased into view, close enough now to cast a pulse across the interior of her car. There was no siren, no sudden bark of the speaker, just the unmistakable request for her to pull over. Without speaking, without shifting her expression, Ayanna clicked on her blinker and brought the car down to a steady glide, steering it carefully toward the gravel shoulder where the roadside gave way to tall weeds and the skeletal remains of an old fence post. She placed the gear in park, turned off the engine, and lowered her window halfway before placing both hands squarely at the top of the steering wheel. She didn't reach for her bag, didn't search for paperwork, didn't twist in her seat to look behind her. Not yet. She waited, letting the wind carry the buzz of insects through the open air, listening for the rhythm of boots on gravel. 2 doors shut in near-perfect unison behind her. Then came the footfalls. They approached slowly. One figure cut left, the other right, each flanking her vehicle with the kind of choreographed ease that came from repetition, not training. The first deputy, a broad-shouldered man with a closely shaved head and mirrored sunglasses, walked with a forward tilt to his frame, as if he wanted each step to announce more than his uniform already did. The second deputy, leaner, stayed a few feet back on the passenger side, watching, listening. He didn't speak, but his presence was measured, less brash but no less assured. The first deputy rapped twice on the glass with the knuckle of his index finger. Not hard enough to startle, just enough to make it clear that patience would not be part of the exchange. Ayana turned her head toward him, keeping her hands still. Her expression was unreadable. Not indifferent, just composed. He leaned slightly toward the window, his sunglasses masking his eyes. License and registration. His voice was flat, impersonal. Not impolite, but far from courteous. She met his tone with one of her own, evenly measured and stripped of anything that could be mistaken for fear or defensiveness. "Certainly, officer," she said. "May I ask the reason for the stop?" He hesitated a beat longer than protocol called for, his mouth shifting slightly before he answered. "You're missing a rear plate." Ayana's eyes didn't waver. "This is a rental," she replied. "There's a valid temporary tag affixed to the inside of the rear window." The man didn't turn to check. He didn't ask for clarification or glance toward the glass. Instead, he straightened just slightly and responded in the same flat tone, now shaded with an edge of indifference. "Still required to be mounted visibly. That's the law." Her voice didn't change. "You're welcome to confirm the tag, officer. It's clearly displayed." The second deputy shifted closer to the passenger side, hands resting on his utility belt. He still hadn't spoken, but the air around them changed. It didn't hum with urgency. It slowed, like tension gathering weight. "You local?" the first deputy asked, voice tighter now, the question abrupt. "No," Ayana replied, her gaze still steady on him. "I'm passing through." "Where you headed?" he asked, the rhythm of the exchange no longer routine. She paused just long enough to emphasize calm without appearing hesitant. "I'm returning to Virginia." "That's a long drive," he said, his tone flattening again, less curious than confrontational. She inclined her head slightly, the answer quiet, direct. "Yes, it is." The silence that followed felt deliberate, as if he were waiting for something she hadn't offered. An explanation, an apology, a shift in her tone. When none came, his expression hardened into something colder, and the pause that followed was no longer professional. It was personal. "Step out of the vehicle," he said finally, the words coming slow, stripped of courtesy. Ayana did not move, only turned her head slightly as if to make her next words clearer. "Officer," she said, her voice as steady as before, "I'm exercising my right to understand the reason for being asked to exit the vehicle. If possible, I'd like to speak with a supervisor." That request landed like a stone dropped in a quiet room. The second deputy finally shifted from the passenger side, taking a step forward, while the first deputy's posture stiffened noticeably. She had not raised her voice, had not leaned back or recoiled. She had simply spoken with the poise of someone who expected the law to be respected. And yet, it was that composure that seemed to press against something brittle in the deputy's pride. "You think you know how this works?" he asked. The question curled in something sharp. Ayana didn't respond to that. She had already said enough. He took one step back from the door, not in retreat, but to reassert physical dominance, letting his hand settle deliberately close to the butt of his sidearm. The silence around them stretched taut, thinner than paper, thicker than air. Then, with a voice that no longer held the shape of duty, he delivered the final warning, not as a procedural necessity, but as threat. "Ma'am," he said coldly, his tone drained of all neutrality. "Step out now, or we make you." The moment hung there, suspended, as though even the surrounding landscape recognized the shift in tone and lowered its breath accordingly. The wind that had been moving lazily across the fields seemed to pause. The second deputy, still without having said a word, moved closer to the passenger side, his hand drifting with casual precision toward the clasp of his holster. The other one, the one still standing at her window, now leaned in and tapped the glass again. This time not with the knuckle of two fingers, but with the flat of his palm. The sound was louder, harder, a kind of punctuation that didn't ask. It told. Ayana did not react to the noise. Her posture remained composed, her shoulders level, hands clearly displayed at the top of the steering wheel in the open afternoon light. The tap had not startled her, nor had the increasingly tense body language of the man outside her door. She had encountered men like him before, on borders, in negotiation rooms, at checkpoints built less on law and more on ego. There was always a moment when the uniform was no longer the source of power. It was the hand resting on the weapon that began to speak instead. She turned her head, slowly and deliberately, so he could see her face, see that she wasn't flinching, wasn't hiding, wasn't unaware. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but undeniably firm. "Officer, I've complied with your requests. The vehicle is properly tagged, my documentation is in order, and I've answered all of your questions. Unless there is a clear legal reason, I would prefer not to exit the vehicle until a supervisor arrives." Her words were smooth, polished, informed by years of training in how to speak under pressure without inviting escalation. But out here, on this quiet stretch of nowhere, where the air hummed with heat and unchecked authority, that very restraint became its own kind of provocation. The deputy stiffened slightly at the mention of procedure, his jaw tightening just enough to betray the irritation that had been steadily building since the moment she spoke her first word. In his world, cooperation meant submission, and anything less than that read as defiance. She hadn't shouted, she hadn't resisted, but she hadn't folded either, and that was more than enough to press his pride into action. "You're being uncooperative," he said, stepping back just far enough to unclip the strap across his sidearm. The motion was practiced and fluid, not rushed, not reckless, but unmistakable in its intent. His hand hovered close now, the leather creaking faintly under his thumb, as though the weapon had been waiting to be needed all along. On the other side of the car, the second deputy, Wilcox, had begun to move as well. He rounded the rear of the vehicle with slow, deliberate steps, his gaze fixed ahead but not searching. He didn't glance at the rear window, where the temporary registration tag sat clearly affixed and entirely legal. He didn't pause to check the paper, didn't reach for his radio, didn't call it in. Instead, he moved into position just behind her driver's side door, flanking his partner like a man who had done this routine enough times to know what came next. Ayana didn't move. Her fingers remained still against the wheel, her eyes forward. She didn't plead or argue or escalate, not because she didn't know what was happening, but because she did. This moment was no longer about the tag or the plate or any policy they might pretend to reference. It was about their belief that they could do this, and that she would have no choice but to take it. Without another word, both deputies moved in at once. Kettering reached for the door handle and yanked it open with a force that made the hinges strain. The sun poured into the driver's seat, sharp and sudden, as his shadow fell across her lap. Wilcox stepped in almost immediately behind him, both men acting not as officers resolving a legal issue, but as men seizing control from someone who had dared to speak, like she had the right to be there. Ayana was pulled from the car in a rush of motion that was fast but never uncontrolled. Their movements were too confident, too routine, to be improvised. Kettering gripped her left arm and twisted it behind her back, while Wilcox caught her right wrist and pulled downward, forcing her upper body to bend at the waist. Her knees hit the gravel with a sharp impact, and she felt the edge of stone pressing through the fabric of her slacks. One palm scraped along the coarse dirt, while the other was shoved into a cuff before she could even react. Not that she tried to. She didn't resist. Not in any way they could use. She didn't tense her shoulders or stiffen her spine. She allowed the weight of their hands, the force of their pressure, the insults muttered under breath to roll off her like water on iron. Her breathing remained slow. Her eyes remained open. And through it all, she said nothing. The sound of the second cuff locking into place rang louder than their footsteps, louder than the breath that escaped from their chests when they realized she wasn't fighting back. Kettering leaned in, close enough for her to hear the rasp of his voice above the cicadas. "Should have just done what you were told." She didn't answer. She didn't give him the satisfaction of fear or fury. Instead, as her cheek pressed into the gravel, she focused on what mattered. The badge number on his chest, 62117, and the vehicle ID painted just above the cruiser's rear fender, Unit 6A92. She noted the placement of their weapons, the callousness of their grip, the indifference in their execution. It was all recorded, not on any body cam, those would malfunction, she was certain, but inside the quiet archive of her mind. They hoisted her to her feet, her arms pinned behind her, her body dusted in gravel and silent defiance. Neither man looked her in the eye. Neither man asked who she was. She didn't offer it. And as they led her to the back of the cruiser, she kept her gaze on the horizon, already calculating how long it would take for this moment to begin unraveling. The cruiser's back seat was cramped, the hard plastic bench molded in a way that discouraged comfort and conversation alike. The cuffs bit into her wrists where they'd been fastened too tightly, the metal pressing into her skin with each slight shift of movement. The cabin smelled faintly of sweat, old vinyl, and whatever lingered from whoever had last been in the same seat. The air conditioning barely registered, as though even the vehicle itself considered her undeserving of relief. Neither deputy spoke as they drove. The road ahead stretched out in silence, broken only by the low hiss of tires rolling across coarse asphalt. Ayanna sat still, her back slightly tilted to accommodate the rigidity of her arms behind her. Her posture was not one of defeat. It was endurance, the kind that required no expression. She studied the route through the narrow grille between the seats, noting landmarks, road signs, the twist of the turn just before they pulled into a cracked lot behind a building whose windows glared with yellowing fluorescence. She did not ask where they were taking her. She already knew. Inside, the routine began. They guided her through double doors with worn blue paint and into a processing area that smelled of aging coffee and industrial floor wax. The woman behind the intake desk glanced at her with passing curiosity, then looked back at her screen, uninterested in asking why a woman with no visible struggle marks, no visible drugs, no screaming protest, and no ID was being processed like someone caught stealing copper wire in the backwoods. No questions were asked, not by the deputies, not by the clerk, not even by the sergeant who signed her in. Her fingerprints were taken, her wrists uncuffed, and her belongings, a leather wallet with sanitized ID, an unremarkable key, and a federal-issued burner phone, were placed in a plastic tray with a barcode she never heard them scan. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered once. Behind her, one of the deputies, Kettering, muttered under his breath as he removed his gloves. Another one, thinking she's above the law. The line wasn't meant for anyone in particular, but it was said loud enough to be heard by all. No one laughed, but no one challenged it either. Ayana stood quietly as her photograph was taken. Her posture did not falter. The camera flash barely registered. She was walked through another set of doors, this time into the cold, tiled corridor of a holding cell block. The hallway was quiet, the kind of sterile silence that swallowed sound. No questions, no calls, no options offered, no demands made. She had never once asked for a phone call, had never offered her name beyond the basic ID card handed over hours earlier. The name on that card, Elena Frost, was valid, if not real. The identity had been carefully constructed for situations like this, woven through enough federal systems to appear authentic, yet designed to dead-end the moment anyone tried to dig deeper. The deputy escorting her seemed almost bored by the lack of resistance. "You don't talk much, do you?" he said, though the words came out like a statement more than a question. She looked straight ahead and said nothing. The cell door clicked behind her, closing with a dull finality that would have rattled someone less prepared. The cot was narrow. The walls were concrete, painted over in institutional beige. She sat down slowly, hands folded, her eyes not fixed on the wall or the floor, but resting somewhere beyond the room itself. She had spent nights in bunkers without light, nights beneath steel ceilings listening to distant shelling echo across darkened valleys. This was nothing. This was quiet. Hours passed in pieces. A shift changed. A second. Voices moved past the hallway outside, hushed and low. No one came to check on her. The system didn't need to. It had done what it was designed to do: process, categorize, and forget. She listened to the rhythm of the vents, the mechanical hum of surveillance that might have been real or imagined, and let her body stay perfectly still. Not out of submission, but control. Her stillness had purpose. It always had. Eventually, the door clicked again. She was led back through the corridor, this time without commentary. The deputy in charge of her release barely glanced at the screen in front of him. He spoke to someone on the phone as he signed off the paperwork, nodding at something Ayana couldn't hear. The only word she caught was clear. And even that came with the shrug of someone who didn't care why a name turned up clean. Only that it did. No one asked her if she needed a ride. No one offered water or paperwork or a folder stamped with instructions. She was simply handed her belongings in a plastic bin, wallet, phone, keys, and walked back through the same doors she had entered under restraint, this time unshackled and unspoken to. Kettering was in the hallway outside the intake room, arms crossed, posture loose, face unreadable. He looked at her as she passed, but not with recognition, only that familiar tightness that clung to men who expected consequences and didn't find them. She passed him without pause, without a word. Wilcox stood near the parking lot, his gaze lingering on the cruiser, then on her. He didn't speak either. He simply watched as she walked across the gravel to where her car had been towed and quietly returned by someone during the night. The keys clicked smoothly into the ignition. The engine turned over without hesitation. She settled behind the wheel with the same steady hands she'd held on the wheel hours earlier, her spine tall, her breathing measured. No questions asked, no identification confirmed, no supervisor called, just silence. She drove away slowly, the tires crunching against gravel before finding pavement again. The early morning light stretched long across the road ahead, the horizon wide open and waiting. She did not look back. Morning settled over the sheriff's department in uneven streaks of light that filtered through the narrow front windows, cutting across dusty surfaces and revealing fingerprints on glass that hadn't been cleaned in weeks. The scent of burnt coffee hung low in the air, mingling with the faint tang of boot polish and old paper. Inside the bullpen, monitors buzzed quietly and keyboards clacked in uneven rhythms, the early shift unfolding with the dull inertia of a routine too old to be examined. At first, it was small. A flicker here, a missing entry there. The arrest report for the previous night didn't register in the digital system. Kettering clicked through the interface, then refreshed, then tried again. Each time, the screen returned with the same vague error. Entry incomplete. Submission blocked. He muttered something under his breath, loud enough for Wilcox to hear from the next desk over. Wilcox glanced over the top of his monitor but said nothing, his own screen reflecting a separate issue. His internal email inbox had begun rejecting outbound messages with strange formatting errors he hadn't seen before. The kind of thing IT always blamed on the user. But he wasn't doing anything unusual. At least, not today. Kettering tried to re-enter the arrest record, this time skipping the incident description altogether and inputting just the basic fields. Time, location, name. The system froze. Then the page blinked and closed itself. "You getting anything weird on yours?" Kettering asked without looking up. Wilcox nodded, though his jaw was tight. "Mine just bounced 3 reports. Not even big ones. Junk files, really." He leaned closer to his screen and squinted at a flagged message. Access denied by external filter, followed by a line of gibberish code that didn't belong to any department protocol. Kettering reached for his desk phone, intending to call records to see if their side had picked up the arrest log, but the line clicked without a ring, then went dead. He put the phone back down slowly. Then he tried again. This time it rang once before disconnecting. "They're updating the system again," he said flatly, not because he believed it, but because saying it out loud gave it shape. Wilcox didn't answer. Across the room, Officer Damon Price entered with a fresh notepad tucked under one arm and a half-empty thermos in the other. He was younger than most in the department, still carrying that quiet balance of alertness and restraint that marked someone still listening more than he spoke. He walked to his desk, nodded to the receptionist, and set the thermos down gently before logging in. His screen flared to life, familiar and unchanged, until he clicked into the report logs and noticed something strange. There was no entry for Kettering's traffic stop from the previous night. Price frowned and refreshed the page. The timestamp should have been there, a standard tag that marked every interaction by cruiser location and officer ID. But the gap was obvious. A blank line where a row should have been, as though someone had started the record but left before saving anything. He double-checked the date, then the vehicle number. Still nothing. He stood slowly, his notebook still unopened on his desk, and made his way over to the printer server in the hallway alcove, where the hard copies were automatically generated for arrest logs once they cleared approval. The machine was running, whirring softly, but when he flipped through the stack in the output tray, there was no mention of an arrest between 5:12 p.m. and 7:02 a.m., a 7-hour blackout. Price returned to his desk and opened a new file on his terminal. He began jotting notes, not on paper, not by hand, but in a quietly encrypted folder tucked beneath a subdirectory most users wouldn't bother looking through. Just observations, dates, names, gaps. He didn't ask questions yet, not aloud. But his eyes scanned the office differently now, catching the way Kettering's brows were furrowed with something less than frustration and something more than technical error. The way Wilcox kept checking over his shoulder, eyes landing briefly on Price before flicking away again. Later that day, Kettering's background check, a routine security update submitted for his participation in a state task force rotation, came back flagged. Not denied. Not rejected. Just paused. Pending verification, it read, followed by a non-local routing number that no one recognized. When he called personnel to follow up, the voice on the other end seemed confused. "There's no reason it should have stopped there," the woman said. "It didn't even hit the flag protocol. It just rerouted." Kettering's voice dropped. "Rerouted to where?" "I don't know. she said. "It disappeared after the first scan. System says it was redirected for clearance review, but that's federal, not ours." He hung up and stared at the handset for a long moment before standing and walking out of the room. Wilcox didn't follow. Back at his desk, Price finished typing a summary of the discrepancies. No timestamp for the booking, no intake video logged, no cruiser dash footage assigned to the record number. He had seen plenty of errors in this system, but never all at once, never overlapping in a way that erased a full arrest from every internal log. He saved the document. Then he copied it to a second folder and encrypted it again. If anyone was watching, he made sure they saw only a young officer typing up routine notes, maybe writing a report, maybe planning a call. Just another quiet day in a quiet office. But inside his mind, something had shifted. The system wasn't broken. It was being pushed. And someone, somewhere above their pay grades, was already pushing back. The morning sun filtered through the vertical blinds like a spotlight no one had asked for, laying thin stripes across the department's report room where the fluorescent lights always buzzed slightly louder than anyone wanted to admit. Inside, the hum of tired conversation and hollow keystrokes was broken only by the occasional muttered curse from a printer that hadn't worked properly since the last election. Officers moved with the slow, sluggish pace that marked paperwork days, when the hours were longer and the stakes felt low, at least on the surface. But something was different today. The email came in just after 9 a.m., its subject line stripped of urgency, masked in the careful language of internal review. Request for supplementary materials. Body cam footage. Incident report. Number 54107. It had been addressed to Wilcox, but the CC field had included the sheriff himself, as well as the regional internal affairs liaison. The request was specific, narrowed to the time frame of the previous night's traffic stop and the immediate aftermath. It named both deputies and cited the cruiser unit by its vehicle number, 6A92. Wilcox stared at it longer than necessary, as if hoping it would disappear if he refused to blink. Kettering, already hovering beside him with a paper cup of stale coffee in hand, leaned over and scanned the message quickly. He didn't say anything at first, only took a long sip, and looked away toward the evidence room door, where a single red light blinked above the server cabinet. "They're just fishing," he said finally, though his voice carried none of its usual bravado. "Probably a mistake." Wilcox didn't respond. He clicked the internal drive link attached to the report log, trying to retrieve the video feed from his body camera. The screen loaded slowly, then stopped. A system error popped up in an off-gray box. File not found. Access denied. He tried again, this time searching through the raw footage log manually by timestamp. There was something there. A partial file, marked as corrupt, the duration listed at just under 11 seconds. No audio, no visual, just static. Beside him, Kettering folded his arms and leaned in. "Where the hell's the rest of it?" "I don't know," Wilcox muttered, clicking through nested folders, his face tightening with each failed attempt. "It was there. I remember syncing it. I watched the upload finish." "Then you did it wrong," Kettering snapped, the words sudden and louder than necessary. Heads turned from 2 desks down. "You always rush through the sync. I told you to check the confirmation." Wilcox turned to him, his tone low but taut. "I checked it. You saw me. It was there last night." "Well, it's not there now," Kettering shot back. "So either the system's broken, or you screwed it up." Neither man said anything for a long moment, each staring at the screen as if silence might conjure an answer. The partial clip was useless, a flicker of static and half a timestamp, with no visual ID, no ambient sound, no image of the suspect, just digital noise that might as well not exist. Worse still, Kettering's own feed wasn't missing. It was marked as pending review, but locked behind a restricted file status they didn't recognize. It had a federal prefix, not state, not local. That fact made them go quiet again. In the hallway outside the admin wing, Officer Damon Price passed by slowly, a fresh case file in one hand and a flash drive tucked into the palm of the other. He didn't linger, didn't glance toward the open door, where the tension crackled between the two senior deputies. But he heard enough. The raised voices, the clicks of frustration, the unmistakable sound of men watching something slip out of their control and trying not to admit it. He returned to his desk and sat down, opening the drawer to his right and sliding the drive into place beneath the loose paper tray, where it clicked into the department's USB port beneath the surface lip. He opened the backup tool he had installed quietly weeks earlier, a local archive folder that copied report logs, timestamp inconsistencies, and file deletion histories with every new entry. It wasn't official. It wasn't even standard. But it worked. He began pulling down the records that had been altered in the past 24 hours. 6 files marked as modified, 4 marked incomplete, and 1, the body cam file from Unit 6A92, listed as force deleted by restricted user ID. He made a note of the UID hash string. Then he saved it again, locally and off-site. Across the country, the halls of a concrete security annex in Northern Virginia ran cold and silent under the weight of reinforced glass and badge-locked doors. Ayanna sat in a briefing room with no windows, a cup of untouched coffee in front of her, and a single screen alive with rotating displays, encrypted intel fragments, redacted transcripts, operation logs. A quiet tone sounded in her earpiece, followed by a 2-word message that scrolled in clean white font across the screen embedded in the wall. Phase Y complete. She didn't react, didn't smile, didn't nod. She closed the folder in front of her, slipped the sealed packet into her shoulder bag, and stood. Back in the sheriff's department, Wilcox stormed out of the report room, his face unreadable. Kettering stayed behind, muttering to himself and staring at the screen as if it might offer him a way out. In another part of the building, Officer Price pulled the flash drive from his terminal, slipped it back into his pocket, and closed the screen with a slow, practiced movement. The gaps were growing now, but someone was watching everyone. The address listed on the release forms led them to a cul-de-sac at the edge of the county line, where the pavement grew thin and the houses wore the same tired architecture. Low roofs, peeling paint, and yards that sloped with neglect. The house itself was one of those ranch-style shells with a faded blue door and a dry hedge curled around a porch that hadn't seen a broom in weeks. The mailbox leaned toward the road like it had given up trying to stand straight. Kettering sat behind the wheel, one hand tapping the steering column, the other clenched in his lap. Wilcox stared through the passenger window at the house's front step, his face locked in a squint that failed to find anything out of place, because the place was already empty. They'd driven here on instinct, on the gnawing feeling that something had slipped out from under them. "You think she's still here?" Kettering asked, though his tone already carried the answer. "No," Wilcox said, opening the door and stepping out. He moved up the driveway, slow and methodical, eyes scanning for movement through the cracked blinds. There was no car, no curtain twitch, no mail by the door. No sign of anyone having lived there recently. He knocked anyway, more out of habit than belief. No answer came. Kettering joined him a moment later, standing just behind the porch rail. "You sure this is it?" Wilcox nodded once. "It's the address on file. Match the release form." They stood there in silence, side by side, both staring at a house that offered no explanation. "Could be fake," Kettering muttered. Wilcox didn't argue. He was already thinking it. A tag that didn't check. A name that didn't flag. A report that disappeared. a file that wouldn't open. He reached for his phone, stepping off the porch with the vague urgency of someone who didn't want to say what he was about to do. He opened his contact list and scrolled until he reached a name marked only as J.T. Clearinghouse. The man who picked up spoke with a tired rasp, the kind worn in by years of state-level clearance handling. "This is Wilcox. I need to run a confirmation through the firewall," he said quietly, glancing toward Kettering to make sure he was still out of earshot. Name came up blank on a routine stop. Full prints, no hits. Said she was Elena Frost. There was silence on the other end. Then, "You have her DOB?" Wilcox rattled it off. "Hang on," the voice replied. A soft clicking followed. A moment passed, then another. When the voice returned, it was different, flatter, more mechanical. "We're not showing anyone by that name matching that print set. No match on birth date either. You sure you scanned her?" "Yes." "Well," the voice said, hesitating, "her file didn't vanish. It was never visible." Wilcox paused. "Meaning?" "Meaning," the voice continued. "She's not in our system. Not on paper. Not in the index. If you tried to pull her up anywhere outside your internal log, you'd hit a wall. You were routed off automatically. I'm not supposed to say this, but if that happened, someone upstream wanted it that way. She's got shielding on her identity. Real shielding. Above my clearance." The call ended without a goodbye. Wilcox lowered the phone slowly, looking down at the sidewalk like it might offer him clarity. It didn't. That night, far from the shadows of the small-town sheriff's office, the sterile lighting of a federal complex washed across glass conference walls and polished floors that smelled faintly of paper and steel. Inside one of the rooms, Ayanna sat opposite Director Caney, whose expression never changed, not even as the final report on her desk flashed complete. The folder sat open between them, the contents clipped and sealed under layers of classified routing slips. He watched her for a moment longer before speaking, his voice as calm as hers had been on that roadside hours earlier. "They moved as expected," he said. "No surprises in protocol. No escalation outside projected thresholds." "They broke their own threshold," she replied, her hands folded lightly on the table. "With no provocation." Caney nodded. "That's what makes it usable." She didn't nod in return. She just waited. He tapped a pen once against the folder. "Are you ready to initiate full reversal?" Her answer was immediate. "Yes." Outside the door, two analysts walked by without glancing into the room. One held a tablet marked with a live routing key for 3 active review points. The other carried a sealed envelope headed to Cyber Intelligence Command. Nothing about the room suggested anything unusual was happening. That was the point. Reversal wasn't about chaos. It was about silence, recalibration, removal. Back in the small county office, Officer Price stepped into the locker room, the buzz of fluorescent lights overhead washing pale across the linoleum floor. His shift was over, but he had lingered, waiting for the night crew to filter out, for the hallway to go quiet. When it did, he opened the top drawer of his locker, checked the inside for tampering, then pulled out a padded envelope that hadn't been there earlier. There was no name, no return label, only the shape of a plastic drive inside. He slit the seal with a key, pulled the drive out slowly, and turned it over in his hand. No markings, no instructions. He slipped it into his backpack, zipped it shut, and walked out the back door without a word. No one saw him go, but someone had made sure the right hands were holding the wrong truths. And the next movement, quiet, exact, irreversible, had already begun. The gravel beneath their tires crunched in long, deliberate rhythms as the cruiser slowed to a stop outside the modest single-story home on the edge of the county. A house so unremarkable in appearance it might have vanished from memory the moment you looked away. The lawn was clean but unkempt, as though trimmed with intention, but not fussed over. No flag on the porch. No decorations in the windows. The kind of house that said nothing about the person inside. And that, in itself, said everything. Kettering turned off the engine and let the silence settle between them. Wilcox didn't reach for the door handle immediately. Instead, he stared at the house, at the drawn curtains, at the porch light that wasn't on, even though the sky was already fading into dusk. They had driven here without a radio call, without a report to justify their visit. There was no paperwork, no summons, just the cold heat of frustration that had been growing since the footage went missing, and the files locked themselves behind restricted access. Neither man had said what they were doing aloud, but both knew. This wasn't about the law anymore. "This her place?" Kettering asked, though the question came from a place of defiance, not doubt. Wilcox didn't answer. He was already opening his door. They stepped onto the sidewalk with the measured confidence of men used to being the ones who made people nervous. Their uniforms bore no fresh dirt, no visible sign of the evening's purpose, but their hands hung close to their belts, and their steps were just fast enough to carry intent. They were 6 feet from the porch when the front door opened. Ayanna stepped outside without a word, her presence immediate and absolute. She wore her full-dress uniform, pressed, precise, unyielding in its authority. The dark green fabric caught the dying light and gave it nothing back. Her insignia was displayed clearly across her chest. Lieutenant General, Army Intelligence Division. The ribbons above it told a deeper story, of campaigns completed, of commands held, of nations crossed under fire and silence alike. She did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. On either side of her stood 2 men in plain clothes, each positioned just a pace behind and half a step out from her shoulder. Their expressions were unreadable, their posture neutral but unmistakably trained. No words came from either of them. They didn't move. They didn't blink. Their silence carried weight. The deputies froze at the base of the porch, Kettering's mouth opening slightly before closing again without a sound. Wilcox's eyes moved first to the men, then to Ayanna, lingering on the bars of her insignia before trailing down to the faint gleam of polished metal above her breast pocket. Ayanna took a single step forward, her gaze level and direct. "This," she said, her voice calm and controlled, "is the last time you come near me." There was no threat in her tone, only a certainty that neither man could mistake. Her words didn't rise. They didn't have to. She spoke like someone used to being heard the first time, like someone who had never needed to repeat herself. Kettering blinked, his fingers curling slightly against his thigh, not from aggression, but from confusion. The woman they had pulled from a car and dragged across gravel was now standing before them, wrapped in a history neither of them had been prepared to confront. Wilcox shifted his weight, his voice finally returning, though brittle and uncertain. This isn't what it looks like." Her eyes didn't move from Kettering. "I know exactly what it is." Behind her, the 2 men remained still. Their silence was more powerful than anything either deputy had brought with them. Wilcox took a breath as if to speak again, then stopped. The moment was already over. Ayanna hadn't invited them here, and now they understood. They hadn't come by their own choice either. The 2 deputies turned in near unison, retreating with steps quicker than their approach. They reached the cruiser and climbed inside without another word. The engine roared back to life, but neither looked back as they drove off into the descending dusk, their headlights throwing long shadows across the road as they disappeared into the distance. Ayanna remained on the porch until the vehicle was gone, her shoulders still, her presence unshaken. The plainclothes agents waited until she turned and re-entered the house before following. Across town, in the quiet corner of a nearly empty office, Officer Damon Price stood behind a closed door, facing an internal affairs officer who barely concealed his irritation. "I'm not sure what you were hoping to find," the man said, tapping the report folder on the table with 2 fingers. "But you triggered a review flag with your access history. Multiple restricted queries. Logs pulled without approval. That's not nothing." Price didn't flinch. He had expected this. "I was verifying inconsistencies," he replied. "The data isn't aligning with our protocols." "That's not your job," the officer shot back. His voice clipped. "And it sure as hell isn't something you do without supervision. You're lucky this is just a written warning." The reprimand was slid across the table, its wording carefully measured to avoid admitting what they both knew. Price had seen something he wasn't supposed to. And now, the department had to mark him as out of line without asking why the line had been crossed in the first place. He signed it without comment, folded the paper, and tucked it into his pocket. As he walked out of the room, he didn't look back. He didn't need to, because while they tried to close the gap behind him, Price was already 2 steps ahead, holding truth they couldn't erase, and following a path none of them could see. Not yet. The next morning brought a tension to the department that no one could name out loud. A shift so quiet it might have been imagined if not for the cold facts stacked inside the system like misplaced bricks. Kettering arrived just after 7, expecting the day to unfold like every other. Log in, clear calls, maintain posture. Instead, his keycard, once dependable, clicked twice against the security pad at the front entrance before flashing red. He tried again, pressing it harder as though the extra force might fix what had already been decided. Still red. Denied. He knocked on the glass, and the desk sergeant buzzed him in manually, his voice crackling through the intercom with a hesitation Kettering hadn't heard before. "Might want to check your login when you get in. Systems have been touchy this morning." Touchy wasn't the word for it. At his workstation, the terminal greeted him with a lockout screen. Not expired credentials, not a forgotten password, but a full access restriction stamped with a 3-letter clearance code he didn't recognize. It didn't ask him to reset anything. It didn't even give him the option. Just a sterile gray message box that said, "Administrative lock. Contact Security Administrator." Below that, the text flickered once before resolving into a number he didn't dare call in front of anyone else. Wilcox walked in a few minutes later, his face paler than usual, the dark circles under his eyes more pronounced. He didn't speak as he approached his desk, didn't even glance at Kettering, just sank into his chair and opened his email like a man waiting for confirmation of something he already knew. What greeted him wasn't subtle. 5 notifications blinked in his inbox, each from a different department node. Internal audit, vehicle assignment review, body cam retention request, 2 labeled with vague incident protocol check-in headers. The timestamps were consecutive, each one marked as escalated, each one tied to a date they both recognized. He opened the first. It cited his missing footage. The second requested written confirmation of cruiser location logs. The third, a digital signature from the state evidentiary board he hadn't dealt with in years. But it was the 4th email, short, unsigned, and marked with a classification tag outside local jurisdiction, that made his stomach turn. Subject: Asset Tracking Request. Your access has been logged. Internal integrity review pending. Do not contact external channels. No sender. No footer. No option to reply. He closed the screen and pushed back from the desk, his chair sliding quietly across the floor, the sound somehow louder than it should have been. Kettering looked at him then, not with anger or confusion, but something far heavier. They weren't losing control. They'd already lost it. The system wasn't responding to them anymore. It was closing in. In a neighboring city, across a layer of bureaucracy thick enough to insulate anything but the most direct assault, a document moved silently between encrypted channels. It bore no department logo, no agency seal, Just a project code name printed in bold, colorless text. SILO, it stood for Strategic Internal Law Oversight, a program that technically didn't exist, at least not in any form available to the public, to the press, or even to most federal staffers. It had been built under the premise that systemic abuse didn't just require exposure, it required removal. Quiet, targeted, unsentimental removal. SILO didn't deliver press conferences or produce viral footage. It didn't engage in lawsuits or trials. It didn't need a courtroom or a news cycle. What it did was simpler. It collected patterns, built profiles, and erased problem actors before the rot reached the root. Not through violence, not through spectacle, through silence, through structure. Through systems that bent themselves inward until the weight collapsed, the corrupt from inside out. Ayanna had not been caught in the system. She had been sent by it. Her profile had been selected months prior. Not because she was a victim, but because she was a weapon already tested in the darkest corners of foreign conflict, repurposed now for domestic calibration. Her rank was only part of her value. Her history, her silence, her restraint, that was what made her useful. She didn't need to be protected. She needed to be unleashed. And now that phase 1 was complete, the full reversal had begun. Not against a department, but against the myth of untouchability. Back at the station, murmurs began to spread. Not about the incident itself. Most didn't know, and those who did weren't asking. But they noticed the small signs. Access logs quietly redacted, memos rerouted to oversight boards no one had heard of before. Kettering's badge reclassified from active to administrative standby. Wilcox had received a phone call that morning from a state oversight agent who refused to identify himself, and only asked one question. "Have you spoken to anyone about the stop?" Wilcox hadn't answered. Not because he didn't want to, but because he understood now that the question wasn't about the stop. It was about the silence that followed it. And silence, in this case, was the loudest signal of all. In a quiet neighborhood across the state line, Ayanna sat alone at a clean desk beneath a window, with the blinds half drawn. The room was unremarkable. White walls, no visible surveillance, nothing to suggest a classified briefing node sat beneath the floorboards. A simple laptop rested open before her, screen split between surveillance logs and real-time procedural updates. A single icon in the corner blinked once, then stilled. She scrolled through a new list of names. None of them surprised her. The system didn't need her to speak. It only needed her to act. And when it had, the ones who thought they could bury mistakes in red tape would finally learn what it meant to be seen by something that never needed to blink. The article appeared with no fanfare, buried beneath stories of citywide budget hearings and a weather update predicting rain that never came. It was published on a watchdog outlet that few outside government circles read. Its layout utilitarian, its bylines mostly ignored by mainstream platforms. But for those who knew what to look for, the subtext carried more weight than anything printed in headlines. The headline read, "Quiet Council. Are domestic agencies using military tools in civil oversight?" The opening paragraphs spoke in speculation, not accusation. A string of unnamed sources, references to sealed documents, mentions of strategic frameworks, and oversight mechanisms that blurred the lines between civilian and federal authority. It cited an unnamed program, possibly military adjacent, designed to flag and isolate patterns of misconduct within law enforcement without public disclosure. There were no agency names, no operation codes, no direct claims. But the implication was enough. Those in the know, especially the ones who had once believed themselves untouchable, felt the ground shift beneath their feet. The article didn't scream. It whispered just loud enough to rattle the structure. By midday, the sheriff's department buzzed with tension, not about the content itself. Most hadn't read the article, but about the calls that followed. A state oversight coordinator left a message for the sheriff asking about procedural transparency. A congressional liaison flagged an internal review that had previously been marked confidential. A reporter called Wilcox's personal phone and asked with surgical accuracy, "Did you knowingly violate federal protection parameters during the stop?" Wilcox hung up without answering. Kettering, having been effectively frozen out of his credentials, paced the parking lot in a slow, angry circuit, checking his phone every few minutes as if expecting someone to call and explain what was happening to him. No one did. Behind a desk tucked into the corner of the records wing, Officer Damon Price opened a sealed envelope that had arrived in his inbox during the lunch lull. Inside was a note typed on plain cardstock and a folded slip of paper marked Resolution Agreement. There was no signature, only a line at the bottom for his own. The message above it was simple and brutally direct. Drop your inquiry. Stop your downloads. Keep your badge. No questions. Alongside it was a cashier's check made out to him personally. Enough money to buy silence. Enough to suggest someone had read his reports and wanted them to end. Price stared at the check for a long time without touching it. The ink shimmered faintly in the light. His name spelled out in full. The account number blurred beneath the watermark. He folded the paper, replaced it in the envelope, and slid the whole package into his bottom desk drawer, closing it softly. Then he locked the drawer and turned back to his screen. He deleted nothing. On the other side of the country, in a classified annex nestled between rows of secured office spaces and one-way mirrors, Ayanna sat across from a federal liaison whose name didn't appear on any government roster. The woman's voice was clear, her diction precise, but her questions curved like test wires reaching for exposed circuits. "We've had an inquiry flagged from a House subcommittee," the woman said, "about the program." She didn't use the word silo. Ayanna didn't blink. It was inevitable. They're calling for a policy freeze. They want all Phase 2 assignments reviewed for legality. "They can review what they're allowed to see," Ayanna replied. The liaison paused. "And the part they're not allowed to see? We'll do what it was designed to do." The woman across from her studied her face for several seconds, then folded her hands atop the manila file she hadn't opened once. "There are concerns about operational ethics." Ayanna leaned back slightly, not as a retreat, but to draw a line. There were no concerns about ethics when officers broke the law in daylight. There were no hearings when bodies went cold and files went missing. There was no moral crisis when accountability stopped at the badge. The silence that followed was heavy, but it didn't press against her. It settled instead on the other side of the table. Outside the windowless room, the hallway remained still. A wall of photos displayed personnel who had rotated through clearance positions over the past 3 decades. Not one of them looked back at you. Later that afternoon, Officer Price received another envelope. This one had no letter inside, only a drive, a duplicate of the one he'd hidden, but marked with a timecode index and a file tree that hadn't been in the original. Someone had added context. Someone higher up wanted him to keep going. He plugged it in quietly, checked the source tags, and saw the classification key tied not to the department, but to the Department of Defense. The footage he watched next didn't just show Ayanna being pulled from her car. It showed the stillness in her hands, the precision in her breath, the way she cataloged everything without saying a word. And in the corner of the footage, near the tail light of her rental vehicle, was the faint, unmistakable glow of a tracking tag. Military issue, invisible to anyone without thermal scope access. She hadn't just been stopped, she had been placed. And now, the cleanup had begun. Price backed up the footage, saved it to 3 separate drives. labeled each copy under a different name. He didn't know where this was going. Not yet. But he understood something now. Silo wasn't theoretical. It wasn't an overreach. It was a test that had already passed. The backlash would come. The oversight committees would posture. There would be noise. But noise wasn't a threat to something built to move through silence. Kettering sat in his car at the edge of an industrial lot just off Highway 9, a place where the skeletal remains of half-built warehouses leaned into the wind like old men too tired to stand. The last light of the day was starting to bleed into the edges of the sky, casting the cracked pavement in a dull bronze hue that caught every oil stain and rust fleck like a photograph half-developed. The space was deserted except for a few wind-blown scraps of cardboard and the distant whine of a semi braking on the far-off overpass. It was the kind of place people used for transactions they didn't want traced, just outside the county line, surrounded by nothing, with the perfect amount of plausible deniability. Inside his car, Kettering had been sitting for over an hour. The engine was off, windows cracked just enough to let the fading heat seep in. Though it didn't seem to bother him, he hadn't touched his drink. Something amber in a plastic cup he picked up from a gas station 3 towns back. It sat in the cup holder, like an unused alibi. His thumb hovered over the screen of his phone, the message thread open and glowing faintly against the fading light. At the top of the screen, a name stared back at him. Marcus Venn, Capital Ledger. He had hesitated before typing the message, and then again before sending it. The man was no friend, no ally, just a voice with reach and a history of diving into places where he wasn't supposed to be. That made him dangerous, but also necessary. The message had been simple. Off record. Need to talk. Something happened in the department. Federal-level cover-up. Real story. No politics. Venn responded faster than expected. How soon? Followed by, send the address. Kettering did. He chose the lot specifically for its absence. It had no streetlights, no cameras, no neighbors, just dust and memory. He sat there now, waiting, glancing at his side mirror every few minutes, as if it might catch the flicker of headlights long before his eyes did. But Venn never came. Not in 20 minutes. Not in 40. Not even after the last streak of daylight disappeared, and the wind changed direction, pushing the smell of fertilizer from a nearby field across the lot. Kettering checked his phone again. The message thread was gone. Not deleted. Gone. No contact name. No conversation. When he tried to re-enter Venn's secure address, it bounced with a foreign error code he didn't recognize. He refreshed the page. Tried again. Nothing. Back in his home 2 hours later, Kettering sat at his desk and pulled up one of his lesser-known media tracker sites, an aggregator for internal newsroom moves. He hadn't used it in years, not since his brother-in-law had tried freelancing for a political rag out of North Carolina. There it was, buried in a sidebar no one would notice unless they were looking for it. Marcus Venn, investigative columnist with the Capital Ledger, has accepted an overseas assignment effective immediately. All inquiries will be redirected to editorial staff. No send-off article, no farewell, not even a sign of where he'd gone. Just a neatly folded disappearance tucked behind polite press language. Kettering didn't move for a long time. He just sat there, one hand resting lightly on the desk, while the other curled slowly into a fist. Across town, Wilcox had returned from a short grocery run to find 2 vehicles he didn't recognize parked down the street from his house. They weren't black like in the movies, nor were they flashy enough to attract attention. Just bland, mid-size sedans with state plates and tinted windows dark enough to swallow faces. At first, he didn't pay them any mind. He grabbed the bags from the back seat, made his way up the steps, and unlocked his door with the practiced ease of someone who didn't yet know he was being watched. It wasn't until he went back out to move his car that he saw them again. Still there, still dark, still silent. When they finally approached, they didn't knock. They didn't introduce themselves. They walked up the porch in coordinated silence and presented a sealed document with no visible agency letterhead. A woman with salt and pepper hair and an ID badge that looked wrong in all the right ways handed it to him. Her eyes were unreadable. Her tone was distant. "This is a federal seizure order," she said without inflection. "Cross-agency review. Items listed will be retained indefinitely." Wilcox read the lines slowly, not fully comprehending until her colleague brushed past him into the foyer without waiting for permission. Within minutes, they had opened drawers, unplugged electronics, and boxed up hard drives and USBs he hadn't used in years. His personal laptop, his backup work tablet, even an old phone from a past assignment, wiped clean, but never thrown out. They didn't explain further. They didn't accuse him. They simply acted the way people do when they don't need anyone else's permission. He followed them room to room, not stopping them, not helping either. When he finally asked what the justification was, the woman glanced at him and offered the same phrase again. Cross-departmental review. No more. No less. That night, Wilcox sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by silence that had once meant privacy and now meant surveillance. He tried logging into his bank account. The error message appeared before he could finish typing his password. Account temporarily frozen. Contact administrator. When he called the helpline, a cheerful automated voice informed him that an internal audit was underway, and further access would require clearance he no longer had. The moment the call ended, the silence settled deeper. A kind of stillness that made even the humming of the refrigerator feel accusatory. At the same hour, in a secured facility several states away, Ayanna Trask stepped into a briefing room where the air felt vacuum-sealed and sterilized. The walls were lined with embedded monitors, soundproofed against external frequencies, and backed by reinforced material not listed in any contractor blueprint. There was no insignia on the walls, no digital log of who came and went, and no cameras within sight. The men and women who passed through here were documented only by memory, and even that could be stripped if necessary. She was already dressed in the same sharp uniform she had worn in combat zones, the silver of her insignia glinting beneath the recessed ceiling lights. Director Reed waited by the table, tall and spare, wearing the kind of suit that said more about silence than status. He nodded to her once, then gestured to the folder resting near the center of the table. She approached, opened it, and scanned the contents without asking for context. She didn't need any. Phase 2 is cleared, Reed said simply. 3 new sites. They want anchors by the end of the quarter. Ayanna's gaze never left the pages, but the temperature of her presence seemed to shift, settling into something sharper, more directed. Understood, she replied. We'll need embedded analytics within 2 weeks. No contact logs, nothing traceable. Reed closed the folder for her and slid it back toward the center of the table. You'll have it. They've already greenlit expansion in Dade, Owensboro, and Tenley Park. We're building the structure. They want someone who's been proven. Ayanna looked up then, the faintest flicker of satisfaction breaking through her composure. We're not just proving anything anymore, she said. We're executing. The lights above didn't flicker. The screens around the room didn't shift, but something in the air tightened, as if even the walls were holding their breath. She walked out of the room without waiting for further instruction. In her office, under another name in another building, Ayanna pulled up a database marked only with a rotating cipher. It took 3 levels of biometric clearance to access. When it opened, a fresh list of names appeared, cross-indexed with internal affairs, complaints, video footage, suppression records, and disciplinary patterns that hadn't triggered external scrutiny. It was a graveyard of second chances, every name an echo of power abused under the assumption that no one was listening. Ayanna scrolled slowly. She didn't need to read their histories. She already knew how every story ended. And she had just written the next chapter. Kettering woke before the sun, not because he had somewhere to be, but because his body had already begun standing watch, its tension rising in the silent hours while his mind chased shadows. The air in his bedroom was still, weighted with that faint metallic scent of overworked electronics, machines that had been left running overnight, humming softly as if they too were on edge. The glow of his desktop tower, usually steady and reassuring, pulsed like a signal waiting for acknowledgement. But as he crossed the room and reached for the mouse, the monitor stayed black. He jiggled it once, then again, but nothing changed. With a furrowed brow, he crouched to press the power button. The screen flickered briefly, a flash of static that bled into nothingness. A dull whine from inside the casing was the only reply, like the last breath of something that had quietly died hours before. He turned toward his laptop next, trying to rouse it from sleep. Nothing. Not even the faint click of a hard drive waking. When he opened the lid, the screen remained blank, as lifeless as the air around him. His breath caught in his throat as he looked to the shelf beside his desk. The burner phone, the encrypted USBs, even the backup drive he hadn't plugged in since January. They were all dead. No lights, no reaction, no trace of life. This wasn't a power surge or faulty wiring. It wasn't random failure. It was extraction, precision erasure. The kind of wipe that left no mess, no clue, and no hope of recovery. Someone had ghosted his digital footprint with the kind of finesse that didn't come from the public sector. And as that thought crystallized in his mind, he realized the deeper implication. They were no longer trying to cover something up. They were punishing the idea that he had tried to reveal it. He moved toward the corner of the room, knelt beside a loose floorboard, and reached for the slim folder he had sealed there months ago. Inside were copies of what he had salvaged, the first draft of his report, a transcript of Wilcox's side comments after the arrest, and the redacted call logs that had always felt too clean. He slid the board open and reached inside. The folder was gone. His spine stiffened. He stood, turned, then froze. The front door exploded inward with a sound like thunder cracked open. The air filled instantly with shouted commands and blinding white beams from high-powered flashlights. They moved fast, 6 of them, maybe more. No warning, no knock, no warrant announced, just coordinated entry, practiced hands and boots, stomping through a life that had already been erased. He didn't move. There was no point. When the arms grabbed him, twisting behind his back, he didn't resist. When his chest hit the floorboards, splinters biting into his cheek, he didn't ask questions. The ones who came weren't there to answer. As they hauled him upright, his hands cuffed tightly behind his back, someone read out a charge, legal, airtight, and freshly unsealed, tampering with a sealed domestic abuse case under active review. He almost laughed. He remembered that case, remembered refusing to reclassify it as a misunderstanding because the woman's testimony had been too clear, her injuries too precise. He had documented it carefully, preserved everything. Back then, they had thanked him for his thorough diligence. Now they were using it to put him in a cage. The cruiser ride was quiet. The officers didn't speak to him, and he didn't speak to them. He watched the sun rise through the barred rear window, a dull orange smear against a horizon that no longer offered promise. By the time they reached the processing station, the media had already moved on. There was no story now, just a case number and a man who no longer had access to his own defense. Back in Washington, Ayanna stood before a new map. 3 new cities, Dade, Owensboro, Tenley Park. Each marked with a soft digital pulse, each with files already logged under code names and internal flags. Reed had delivered on his promise. Now it was her turn to deliver on hers. She made no announcement, filed no official memo. She simply reactivated an old algorithm, one originally designed to hunt foreign terror cells that had morphed into domestic indicators after too many incidents ended in silence. The same system that had once mapped IED zones in Fallujah now scanned data points pulled from obscure complaints, internal officer reviews, traffic stop patterns, and coded language in precinct memos. And somewhere deep in that system, another name surfaced, another target who didn't know they'd already been chosen. Ayanna didn't react. She logged the timestamp, ran a secondary review for flags, and closed the file. The operation was no longer about what had happened to her. It was about what couldn't happen again. The sun had not yet risen over the sleepy county line when the official notice was quietly posted on the Internal Department bulletin board. The language was sterile, nothing more than a timestamp, a badge number, and a brief line that simply read, Deputy Martin Wilcox, status, inactive, effective immediately. No press release followed. No official briefing gathered the ranks. There was no morning address, no hallway whispers beyond those that carried their own weight in silence. Wilcox's locker had already been emptied by the time most of the department arrived for the early shift. The door stood ajar, cleaned out so completely it seemed he had never been there at all. A uniformed courier, one no one could place, and who wore no insignia save a faint patch with a security barcode, signed for the contents without exchanging more than 2 words. He left through the back stairwell without ever glancing at the front desk. By the time the sun reached its full height in the sky, Wilcox's name had vanished from the digital duty roster. His credentials, badge number, clearance level, network access, showed as deactivated. Not suspended. Not under review. Just erased. The Internal Affairs system simply redirected anyone searching for his file to a blank screen with a placeholder note. Request denied. Code level authorization required. No charges were announced. No detainment location was disclosed. The chatter died faster than it rose, as though whatever had reached out and plucked Wilcox from his post had also stolen the collective breath to ask where he'd gone. At home, hours later, Officer Damon Price stood in the narrow entryway of his duplex, staring at the envelope in his hands. It was unmarked, folded from thick ivory stock that didn't feel like mail so much as a message. There was no return address, no postage, not even a seal. Just his name written in sharp black ink across the front. He had retrieved it from his mailbox instinctively, not thinking much of it until the weight shifted in his fingers. He closed the door softly behind him, peeled off his jacket, and set the envelope on his desk beside his untouched dinner. His eyes didn't leave it as he pulled out the chair and sat down. The room around him was quiet, his living room light casting long shadows over the carpet. The TV still paused from earlier when he'd abandoned the news out of disgust. Price picked up the envelope and opened it slowly. Inside, cushioned against the heavy paper, was a single bronze coin, solid, smooth-edged, about the size of a silver dollar. He turned it over in his palm, noting the faint tarnish around the edges and the deep engraving in the center. On one side, an eagle perched on a pedestal without inscription. Its wings weren't fully spread, not in flight, but extended just enough to suggest readiness. On the reverse side, one word was stamped clean into the metal. Silo. There was no letter, no context, no explanation. But the meaning struck him with absolute clarity. This was not a reward, not a thank you, not even a warning. It was an acknowledgement. He had been seen. He had been measured. And whoever had sent this coin knew exactly how far he had gone, and how far he was still willing to go. Price leaned back in his chair, the coin resting in the center of his palm, its cold metal anchoring the thoughts beginning to churn in his mind. The footage he'd found, the gaps in the arrest logs, the way internal systems had begun subtly shifting around names like Kettering and Wilcox, all of it pointed to something far larger than a rogue traffic stop. Something embedded. Something strategic. Now, one of the men involved was gone. And Price, without ever calling a number or forwarding a file, had been contacted. He took a deep breath and closed his fingers around the coin, feeling its weight press against his skin. He didn't know what came next, not exactly. But he knew this was not over. And somewhere in the dark corridors of an unlisted office, behind closed doors where the names of officers and civilians alike were arranged into patterns no public court would ever see, another list was already updating. Wilcox was no longer on it, but Price was. The highway bent gently around the curve, the edge of the shoulder tapering into an open sweep of land that looked nearly identical to the one Ayanna had driven across months before. The same leaning fences remained, still unpainted and half swallowed by weeds, the same stretch of open sky pulling low over the horizon with a kind of quiet that never asked for attention. Her hands rested loosely on the steering wheel, fingers relaxed, yet her posture retained the stillness of control, not born from ease but from preparation. It wasn't vigilance, not anymore. It was what remained when vigilance had become second nature, when one no longer questioned whether they were being watched or targeted, but instead moved with the calm assurance that if something were to come, they would already be halfway through their response before it fully arrived. The road hummed beneath the tires of the silver vehicle, familiar now, not because it was welcoming, but because it had already betrayed her once. Still, no tension passed through her jaw, no check glances into the rearview mirror, no trace of apprehension in the way she carried her presence inside the space. The days of instinctively bracing for a second patrol unit to crest the bend behind her were over. Nothing followed. There were no radio bursts echoing from somewhere just out of sight, no casual intimidation pacing her speed from 2 lanes back, and no eyes watching from a cruiser's glare. This time, the road stayed clean behind her. At the mile marker where it had all changed, she signaled and turned without hesitation, the gravel rising beneath her tires with the same dull crunch as before. The only difference now was the meaning behind the act. Then it had been the sound of surrender, forced, involuntary, demanded by voices louder than protocol and more arrogant than law. Now it was a sound of return, not for closure, not even for memory, simply for presence, for ownership, for the quiet that followed when silence had been earned rather than imposed. She pulled into the rest stop without slowing her rhythm, the turn fluid, unbroken, and parked beneath the shadow of the same rusted shelter where months earlier she might have hesitated. She left the car running, engine barely audible beneath the wind brushing through the high grass. Across the lot, beside a black SUV with tinted windows and no plates, stood Reed, dressed in plain clothes that made him look like someone forgettable, which meant everything about him was deliberate. He didn't wave. He didn't approach. He waited. Ayanna exited the car, her steps measured not in urgency but in exactitude, a precision of pace that spoke of someone who never once believed her job ended at a desk. She joined him beneath the shelter, the wooden slats of its roof creaking faintly above them, the smell of pine, dust, and something warm and electric in the air, the kind of scent that drifted through static just before a storm. Reed didn't look at her when he spoke. His gaze remained fixed somewhere on the horizon, as if watching for a pattern only he could detect. "You're still the best field star," he said, voice low but certain, not out of formality, not even out of flattery, but as a fact handed down like any other detail in the chain of operation. Ayanna did not smile. There was no satisfaction in her reply, only clarity. "I know." Her eyes stayed forward, fixed beyond the lot, beyond the roadside, even beyond the moment. There was no ego in her response, just the acknowledgement of what had always been true. She had not been tested in that roadside takedown. She had been deployed, and now that deployment had ended, not in headlines, not in indictments, not in trials, but in removals so clean they would never be connected to her name by anyone who didn't already understand how power truly moved. Behind them, several states away, the last loose ends of the incident were being swept and boxed beneath layers of clearance that could not be pierced without consequence. James Kettering remained in a secure holding facility where even the guards assigned to his block rotated out before they could ask too many questions. His court date, if it ever arrived, would be postponed indefinitely, always pending, always scheduled for a later review, buried in the bureaucratic molasses of domestic misconduct investigations that never reached the surface. Martin Wilcox had been disappeared with more subtlety. His detainment had not registered on any standard enforcement watch list. The local press hadn't caught wind, and even his own family had received no notice, no visit, not even a call. The story, as it would be remembered by those who knew nothing of what had truly happened, would quietly suggest that he had burned out, resigned early, maybe even fled something he couldn't explain. No one would say blacklisted. That word didn't exist in the lexicon of polite departments. But inside systems that didn't use words at all, only access points and gate codes, his name had been struck through like a corrupted file. There had been no need for revenge, no need for spectacle, only execution. Reed finally turned his eyes toward her, but his voice carried something else now. Not briefing tone, not protocol, but intent. Another stop this week. Different jurisdiction. Same pattern. She glanced sideways, not in alarm, only in recognition. What triggered it? He pulled a folded note from his coat pocket, passed it to her without elaboration. Temporary tag. Officer-initiated questioning. Right before the escalation, the system flagged the vehicle. Silent redirect went out. Supervisor ordered disengagement. Incident closed in 97 seconds. Ayanna unfolded the paper and skimmed it. The name on the report didn't matter. Not in the way the absence of follow-up did. There had been no takedown, no need for escalation. The system had done its work. Quietly, precisely, without needing her presence. Marine Corps analyst, Reed added. Wife and child in the car. Never even realized how close it came. Ayanna nodded, her fingers pressing the edge of the paper once before folding it again and sliding it into her jacket. Her thoughts had already moved on, not away from the incident, but through it, forward to the next node in the growing lattice of embedded surveillance, interagency flags, and algorithmic checks designed not to profile, but to protect. Not in theory, in practice. And in her pocket, the coin remained where it had always been. Bronze, cool, weighted with purpose. She didn't need to take it out to feel it. She didn't need to see its words stamped into the surface to remember what it meant. She turned and walked back to her car without another word. Behind her, the rest stop remained empty, wind brushing once again through the slats above Reed's head as he returned to his vehicle. There would be another meeting, another city, another node to calibrate. But not today. Today, the road stayed clear. And someone else, somewhere else, who had once believed their badge made them untouchable, had just been reminded that there were systems now watching systems, ones that didn't blink, didn't warn, and didn't wait for permission. The room where Ayanna Trask sat bore no signs of urgency. There were no flashing screens, no maps pinned to the walls, no red lines threading across regions with flagged activity. It was a space built not for decisions in motion, but for finalization, for conclusions signed, sealed, and archived. Her posture hadn't changed since she entered. Her back remained straight, her expression as composed as it had been months ago on the side of a dirt road lined by failing fences and indifferent trees. The difference now was that the mission had completed its arc, not because it had faded or because public notice had been taken, but because what needed to be removed had been erased with surgical precision. On the polished surface before her rested a single black-bound notebook. She opened it slowly, flipped to the final page, and wrote the last line of the operational log in clean, slanted script. No embellishment, no commentary, just a timestamp, a location code, and 2 initials. Then, without ceremony, she closed it, securing the elastic around its cover with a deliberate movement that felt more like a gesture of respect than closure. She rose from the chair, tucked the notebook into a case that matched nothing else in the room, and walked toward the exit without a single glance backward. Later that week, in a hearing held behind 3 layers of security and attended by no more than 12 individuals with clearance codes etched into military servers, Silo was presented, reviewed, and approved for permanent deployment. There were questions, of course, cautious voices warning about precedent, oversight, and long-term transparency. Ayana answered everyone, not with passion, not with pleas, with data, with precision, with unflinching truth that had no need for interpretation. Silo was not a theory. It was a proven operation, and it was now no longer temporary. 10 more cities would follow. The team was already assembled. Field assets were live. The learning algorithm embedded into the core had evolved past its initial protocols, now capable of real-time pattern recognition drawn from suppression patterns, falsified stop reports, unfiled body cam activations, and dozens of other indicators that most departments never thought to encrypt. Silo didn't seek justice by reacting to violence. It prevented it by exposing corruption before it could metastasize. Yet beneath the structure, Ayana had played her own game. She had always known there was a leak. The moment the timing of a back-end systems flag didn't match the data logs during Phase 1, she had started her own silent assessment. Not every betrayal was born of hatred. Sometimes, the most dangerous ones were born of ego. Her leak had been a rising star, impressive credentials, eager recommendations, fluent in every acronym of reform. But Ayana had learned long ago that ambition unmoored from discipline was the most efficient way to sabotage an operation from within. So she let him in. She gave him access. Access to curated logs, fabricated site maps, even dummy operations designed to elicit questions he couldn't resist asking. Every file he pulled had been built for him. Every anomaly he flagged had been placed in his path. And when he finally shared what he believed was the damning core of Silo's existence with an outside source, Ayana had already ensured that the story would collapse under its own falsified details. The publication that received it issued a quiet retraction 2 days later, citing compromised digital integrity. Now, standing in the corridor outside the Pentagon's Secure Records Wing, the man who had once believed himself a whistleblower stood flanked by 2 agents in tailored suits, without visible weapons. His face was pale, his shoulders drawn tight. Not because he feared exposure, but because he had just realized the scale of her foresight. She approached without haste, her footsteps quiet, precise. When she stopped before him, she didn't gloat. She didn't raise her voice. Her tone was even, her gaze calm. "Silence is the strongest signal," she said, her words landing with the gravity of a completed sentence, rather than the opening of a debate. He opened his mouth to respond, but whatever words he might have offered died in the air between them. She turned before the agents did, not bothering to watch his removal. She didn't need to. His exit had been written before he even entered the program. She returned to her office in a building whose signage had changed 3 times in the last month, entered through the side entrance using a biometric panel that only activated for a precise sequence of pressure and timing. Inside, her desk was empty save for the notebook she had carried with her since the beginning. She placed it gently into a locked drawer, turned the key, and then opened her terminal. A new dashboard had appeared, one that didn't exist yesterday. 10 cities, 3 already live, 7 more greenlit. The screen showed no names, no faces, just coordinates and patterns. Outside, the sun had risen fully, casting gold and silver reflections off the rows of glass facades that lined the federal district. Ayana stood at the window and watched as a bird flew low across the avenue, cutting a diagonal line of movement that no one noticed below. Behind her, the system was already scanning a new report. Somewhere in another jurisdiction, another badge had crossed a line it thought invisible. But the invisible lines were the ones CeeLo traced with surgical clarity. Ayana Trask had written the first chapter. Now, she simply turned the page. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.